This is Derek Strauss, and I'm here to introduce our next session, session 11D, which is entitled Building a Responsible Data Sharing Ecosystem. A responsible data sharing ecosystem, something that all of us want, right? And to take us into this, we are going to have a moderator, Anne Flanagan, from the World Economic Forum, and Anne will introduce the rest of the panelists. And just as we go, please, if you have questions, please go ahead and post them into the chat on the Hoover platform, and we'll be bringing those across to the panelists as we go. There'll also be some time probably at the end where we can really address some of the questions and answers. So with that, over to Anne.
Thank you so much, Derek. Such a pleasure to be here today. I'm Anne Flanagan. As Derek mentioned, I'm with the World Economic Forum. I'm based out of our San Francisco office, leading a number of projects around data policy and governance, and I am delighted to introduce this absolute all-star panel that we have here today. We have Joanne Stonier, MasterCard's Chief Data Officer, familiar face to many of you, where she is leading MasterCard's innovative efforts while also dealing with the challenges of managing and handling data in this ever-changing space. We're also joined by Stefaan Verhulst, the co-founder of the GovLab, one of the most most amazing academics in the area of data governance, and we're really interested to hear about their cutting edge tools that they are developing at the GovLab. And finally, we have Daniel Lin, who has recently completed a secondment at the World Economic Forum from Salesforce, where he has been in charge of the responsible development of technology project. So it's my great pleasure to be here with you all today. And I would love to start with Joanne, because Joanne, you are a Chief Data Officer yourself. You're really on the front lines. And the theme of this panel here today is around building a responsible data ecosystem. In your position as CDO, you are very familiar with the challenges that are faced by CDOs day to day, with the best will in the world, wanting to improve responsibility, but you have day-to-day challenges to face as well. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you see this topic and what you see as being the biggest challenges facing you, and your viewpoint from the position in MasterCard?
Sure, thank you, Anne. And it's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be with speaking with Stefaan and Daniel on this topic. So, responsible data sharing and responsible data sharing ecosystems is a topic that's near and dear to everyone's heart, and especially after the time that we've been living in, right? COVID has probably accelerated the need to share information and to share data to solve common problems, especially those of social impact. So if we think about as this disease has been running rampant across the globe, all sorts of companies and organizations have had a need to share data and to share insights and to partner together to really solve problems. And in order to do that, though, it really has taken, I think, some companies and some organizations by surprise, and other organizations have really had to lead in order to figure out how do you do this in a responsible and responsible manner, because all of us have different types of laws, requirements, contracts, and rules that we have to adhere to just by nature of the very businesses in which we operate. And MasterCard is no different. We operate a data ecosystem in and of ourselves, right? We are a network of organizations, right? We process payments around the world, and all sorts of other data that we process on behalf of consumers, our banks, our merchants, and governments. And so we think about this issue quite significantly, both for our commercial business, but also for all the work that we do from a social impact perspective. And so when you think about responsible data sharing ecosystems, and when you think about data sharing generally, it usually comes down to the words of data governance, right? How do you begin to think about governance? And I know many organizations have responsible data principles that they begin to use to guide their data activities. And MasterCard is no different. We have our data responsibility principles that we began to develop back in 2018, announced publicly in 2019. And those have guided us very well in all of our data-centric product development and activities, because we do believe that individuals have to be at the center of all of our data-driven activities, because ultimately all products, solutions that we create, whether for our commercial business or social impact, will impact individuals, even as we are mostly a B2B company with a B2C brand. But as you think about it, data ecosystems really are those that think about a data donor company, a company that has data that's going to be given to a data recipient organization. Now, we don't always donate data. We usually give insights in some form. We usually don't give our raw data, but our data is usually fit for some purpose. And usually in data sharing, organizations come up via some type of contract or some type of organizational mechanism to share those insights one-to-one. And most organizations can do that pretty readily. The challenge is when we want to do that many-to-many. And I think that's more of the topic today, and one that I know my good friend Stefaan is going to talk about, and I'm pretty sure Daniel's going to talk about, because that's where the opportunity lies, as well as some of the challenges. So how can we create a data responsible ecosystem and really expand those principles and codes of conduct and codes of governance so that all of us are really thinking about the ways, the practices, and methods of sharing information in a way that really makes sense? So how can we really make sure that we have the right types of participation? And I know the forum's been working on this. I've been working with the forum as we think through what are the basic building blocks that all organizations need to think about. Stefaan and I have been working on this issue probably since we first met. And Stefaan, I hate to admit, I'm not sure what year that was. It might have been 2015, it might have been 2016, when we actually started thinking about how do you do this for social impact? And again, in the world that we're living in, when we want to solve hard problems, and it takes a lot of data, and it often takes data of multiple organizations, we need to think through how do we help organizations participate? How do we make sure individuals feel like they are in control of their data? How do we have transparency in that? How do we have purpose limitations on the use of that data? And how do we have minimization and accountability for all parties? And then what are the legal mechanisms, right? What's the right redress for misuse of data or loss of data? And how are we going to secure all of that information? And so organizations that want to do this, we need to begin to agree to some of these mechanisms. And both the forum, the GovLab, and others are beginning to come up with mechanisms that responsible organizations like mine can begin to adhere to, that line up with kind of what we've each been doing individually as separate organizations, one-to-one, or even in small groups. And so I think we're at a really exciting time right now where responsible data sharing to solve COVID, climate change, disease, after different natural disasters and other things, I think we're at the cutting edge right now of beginning to figure out ways to proceed together in society. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joanne, and love that focus on the shift from the individual organization to what can organizations do together. On that note, I'd like to introduce Stefaan to the panel. And Stefaan, in being involved in the GovLab, you are very much at the forefront of knowing what's happening and what's hot. And there have been a variety of efforts already where the private sector has shared data with third parties to generate insight, particularly when it comes to something like serving the public good, so beyond just commercial uses of data. And you've worked with various public and private actors in establishing and accelerating those types of data collaborations. Could you tell us a little bit more about those and some of the lessons that you have learned towards exactly what Joanne has just been talking about, a more systemic approach, a sustainable and responsible approach to data stewardship? And maybe as part of that, given that this is a CDO audience, how you see the role of CDOs playing into that and how that is evolving when it comes to this type of data sharing?
Great, thanks so much, Anne, for the question and for having me, and a pleasure to be on this panel with Joanne indeed, and with Daniel as well. And it's always a big task to follow Joanne and say something meaningful beyond what Joanne already has alerted to. But indeed, as Anne said, here at the GovLab, we've done quite some work around the issue of data sharing, which we mainly focus and rephrase as data collaboration, because as Joanne already said, quite often, anyway, there is no sharing, but it's really about partnering around providing either functional access to data or considering ways to reuse data in a way that generate impact, social impact. And anyway, that fits within the mission of GovLab, because what we try to do is to really transform the way we go about making decisions in the public interest, leveraging new tools and new technologies. And data obviously is a key tool and a key asset that we can start using in a way that generates social impact. Now, before I go into some of the challenges and ways to go about this, I do want to make two observations from the start. First is that since Joanne indeed and myself started working on this a few years ago, the attention has grown tremendously from the policy community. Especially COVID has even accelerated the interest from the demand side for data to really think about how can we engage the data holding community in a more systematic way to actually leverage some of those data in order to address critical public needs, such as COVID-19 and current and future pandemics, but also, anyway, we're all confronted with, of course, the need for climate adaptation. And so the question here is, of course, how can the public sector and the research community access private health data in order to generate insights that can really help us deal with some of those challenges? And as I said, this has been radically, the interest has been radically increased. Last year, I was on an expert group to the European Commission, which was the Business to Government Data Sharing Expert Group, which released a report and which is now being taken seriously by the European Commission and will likely be translated into policies in their next Data Act. So this is something that, anyway, initially was nice to do, but I think for chief data officers, it's going to be something that, anyway, they will have to start looking into, because the demand from the policy community to really start thinking about access to data for other purposes has grown. I'm also now a member of the expert group to Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, to really help them think through on how do they have access to private sector data in order to improve statistical offices. And this is not just happening in Europe, it's happening worldwide. And I think this is something that, anyway, chief data officers will have to become sophisticated about. The second observation is really that, anyway, this is not easy to do, as Joanne said. And there is no shortage of, anyway, graveyards with pilots out there. And I think the real challenge is to do this, as I said, in a systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. And this is really what we as a community need to start focusing on. How do we do this beyond the pilot, but how do we do it in a way that is sustainable from a business case and a societal case? And also, how do we make sure, of course, that this is responsible? And that's what, anyway, we've been focusing on the last few years. And I'm just going to highlight, and because I don't want to take too much of my time here, highlight a few areas where I think we as a society need to make progress and really need to build a foundation upon which we can build a responsible data sharing ecosystem, as Joanne was referring to. The first one is really to actually call upon the demand side to really become more sophisticated in formulating their demand. Too often what we see is that, anyway, many researchers or the public sector knocks on the doors of the private sector and says, we need access to data, right? And the question is, toward what end, right? And I think we really need to invest in what I call question science. We need a new science of questions that can complement data science, that really can highlight what are the questions that matter to society for which we need data collaborations for. Without having that kind of signal, every question goes, and it will be a huge burden for the, anyway, the data holder to respond to all the questions that come in and review them. And I think we really need to have a stronger signal on what are the kinds of questions that are in the public interest that need to be addressed in a collaborative fashion. And so towards that end also, I think chief data officers have to become chief question officers. What are the questions that their data can answer that are fit for purpose? And so that's the first kind of element to think about. The second element is to really, and that goes back to your question, and on, anyway, why should chief data officers actually worry and look into that as an opportunity? I think organizations, data holding organizations, especially corporations, are gonna have to invest in processes and functions that can respond to solicitations, because we will see an increase in solicitations for access to data, and we will need actually a methodology, a professional methodology to review the solicitations, to assess possible partners, and to do so in a way that is responsible. So having a data stewardship function, which is what we call it, is really going to be important moving forward in order to then facilitate access to data or access to the insights, as Joanne was already saying. And then on top of that, we really need to innovate in operational governance and technical ways of actually doing this. And I've written a piece in Data and Policy where I document 10 innovations that are needed in order to really allow for this kind of responsible data reuse, because as most chief data officers and especially chief privacy officers on today's call know, a lot of the existing mechanisms and policies are based upon purpose specification, i.e. you can only use the data for the purpose that was initially specified. What we are talking about is actually all about reuse of data for other purposes. And so we really need to think about how do we do this in actually a responsible way. And that's where we need a lot more innovation, and happy to reflect on that further. But I'm gonna stop here to at least give some more time to Daniel as well, and especially to learn from Daniel on how we go about this.
Thanks so much, Stefaan. So much there. I think that everyone can take away that really interesting evolution of the chief data officer, this new data stewardship role, and ultimately it is about responsible data sharing. That is why we're here today. And I love what you mentioned there about I think the increasing use of multi-stakeholderism when it comes to the actual development of real regulation. It sounds like things are really hotting up in the European Union, but through greater multi-stakeholder collaboration, I think stakeholders are more empowered than they might originally have assumed that they were. So that's really encouraging to hear. I want to go inside the organization now, and I'd like to invite Daniel Lim to the panel. And Daniel, you have been seconded to the World Economic Forum from Salesforce for over a year at this point, and you've been leading an amazing project with us, the Responsible Use of Technology project, which seeks to apply operational ethics in innovation. It seeks to really operationalize the space of ethics, because responsible data sharing and ethics are in this space of corporate responsibility or ESG, or the organization really taking on almost more of that stewardship role, I think, that Stefaan was talking about. Could you tell us a little bit about that multi-stakeholder effort, that project, and how you see that pertaining to building a more multi-stakeholder, more responsible data ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you, Anne, and thank you to MIT for hosting this discussion on such an important topic. And it's an honor to be able to share ideas with Joanne and Stefaan, with such accomplished panelists. And as you mentioned, the World Economic Forum has been leading this project entitled Responsible Use of Technology. And we've been leveraging the multi-stakeholder approach globally, bringing in civil society, governments, and businesses, and using the agenda-setting power of the forum to work on and provide tools and techniques for leaders and organizations to operationalize ethics, with a focus on really 3 areas. The first is, how might you train and educate an entire workforce who touches and uses technology and builds technologies? How do they deal with and handle ethical issues when they come up? The second is organizational design. How do you design an organization that drives more ethical behavior day in and day out? And then third is specific to products, creating technology products and life cycles, is how much you incorporate steps and tools into the technology product lifecycle to create more responsible technologies or more ethical outcomes with these technologies. And to this end, I think to your question, to build trust in data ecosystems, leaders must start by building an organization that values ethics in technology. Because before you collect data, you're thinking about building a piece of technology and collecting the data, and how might you use that data, as Stefaan mentioned and as Joanne's mentioned. And leaders must really need to create the space and provide first the funding, resources, and time for the teams to deliberate and think about ethical issues. And one of the things we talk about in our community is that the ethics bar should be higher than the legal bar. Regardless of the regulation, there should be a higher bar that organizations and the individual should take on deciding whether a technology should be developed or how it should be used. And that second point, to the second point there, is leaders must create a culture where everyone in the organization plays a role in ethical outcomes of technology. The technology itself is really benign in some ways, but it's how people use it and how they can leverage it and that really matters. And that's really in the hands of every individual. And then the third is really encouraging a deeper connection with their community and society. And one of our community members is the Markowitz Center for Applied Ethics, and they've done a lot of work in this area, and they have a framework on ethical decision-making. And we've incorporated that in the work that we have at the WEF, is building that connection and thinking about those who aren't sitting at the table as you're creating the technologies, as you're thinking about how to share the technology and for what purpose. So that you're not just doing it for those that are sitting at the table and at the room, but really thinking about the broader community and how you can serve the greater good. And we really thought a lot about the specific techniques that you can bring to the organization. And amazingly, Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, some of these great behavioral economic scientists, have created these great ideas around how do you motivate and drive attention, how do you think about construing the topic from a standpoint of ethics rather than the legal bar or the profit and loss bar, as a lot of businesses may do. And we've incorporated that into a paper that we published earlier this year titled Ethics by Design, an organizational approach to responsible use of technology. And it's really through these various techniques, and specifically like using consequence scanning during the product lifecycle, where you're looking at the what if analysis of what if you created this technology, how may it be used, what are the worst case scenarios, so that before it's even built and out the door, you've thought through the potentials of what could happen and incorporate it into the products. And then really driving behavior so that when you're using these technologies, you're using it for greater good and mitigating the risks. So I'll stop there and pass the baton back to you, Anne, because I think there's a lot of great conversation to be had with this group. Thank you.
Absolutely, Daniel. Thank you so much for that. We've heard from inside the organization from Daniel, the CDO role from Joanne, and then stepping outside the box a little bit from Stefaan right into the ecosystem. I think it's one thing that's becoming really clear in this conversation is that there is no single inflection point for intervention here, that it really is a collaborative effort across different stages of the product life cycle, different roles within organizations, and really looking at what the purpose of the data use is as well. I want to turn to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, because I think they'll help us dig a little bit deeper on this topic. And I'm going to open these to whoever on the panel would like to take it up. But I will start with Joanne on one, because I know that it's particularly relevant to you, Joanne, which is that at the data management level, how does this really play out at the data management level? So if you're looking at what's happening in terms of how you're doing business on a day-to-day basis, and what you mentioned there about purpose limitation, data minimization, really taking that responsibility around that data sharing role, what does that look like at the nuts and bolts level?
Well, it's funny because I think that it's part and parcel of our data management practices, right? It's so interesting because I cast my mind back when we first started really looking at this work, and when all of this came up for us as MasterCard created its Center for Inclusive Growth, right, run by my good buddy Shamina Singh, and so we had to really begin to think about our data governance practices, and we already had a robust data governance practice that we were building for our commercial practices. So all you CDOs out there, right? I mean, we of course use data quality, right? we already had a data governance practice, and Stefaan already talked about, fit for purpose, right? So of course, is our data fit for purpose? Stefaan mentioned how we have organizations that come to MasterCard, and we've put together very specific programs where we've had data scholars, right? What we call our data fellows program, individuals who have come to MasterCard to work with us, to actually look at our data, work with my data scientists to come up with different ideas for how our data might be used for social impact. And that's usually some of the best ways for us to figure out ways that our data can be used for greater good, right? But we've had organizations come to us, but it's clear that they don't understand our data profile, what data we have, how it can be best deployed. And so the first thing is really, all CDOs know kind of what ways their data can be best used, right? In which situation, in which context. And so fit for purpose is kind of the place that you have to start, right? And then what's the quality issue? And then what tools are you deploying, right? Are you doing basic analytics, or are you doing something with AI, right? And then once you get into AI, you get into questions of, is the data, going to have some flat sides to it, right? Is it going to be missing information? So then all of a sudden that becomes a problem. And then of course, when you're talking about data sharing, you have to think about anonymization or pseudonymization or other privacy enhancing technologies, right? I'm a financial institution. I have all the financial regulations that everybody's familiar with. We talked about privacy and, privacy enhancing technologies. Perhaps we have to create a synthetic data set. Perhaps we have to do something else. But all of that comes into play when you begin to think about all of the data governance and data management, right? But this is nuts and bolts of what I do every day as part of data governance and data management in the chief data officer role as I design any product or solution. So when I think about it, right, and the way that we've adopted this at MasterCard, it's part of our studio process, right, which is how we do products and solutions commercially, as well as for social impact or for any type of data sharing. So it goes through the same type of screens. And so what Daniel was saying, right, ethical practices, responsible practices become part and parcel of everything that you do. So why I started with kind of that code of conduct and that code of data responsibility, it's that it becomes the guiding North Star for all of the different type of governance in the different context in which we actually act. And so it allows us then to create the governance process, right? And then the data management processes that go one level deeper, what I call the actual practices, when you're looking at the data set that's going to be deployed, the actual data science that's going to be used, and then the product, all of that begins to fit together into your kind of your data practices writ large. So I'll stop there, but it's kind of just what a chief data officer does every day.
I think, JoAnn, you've answered a question that has also come in, which is, to what extent is this technology driven versus policy driven? It sounds like that North Star is very much the policy piece. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I do think that we're going to see policymakers, to Stefan's point, I think policymakers and governments around the world are eager to see more data collaboration. They're beginning to wake up to the fact that data has real value. And so I think they're going to be asking organizations of all types, commercial organizations, for profit, nonprofit, academic institutions, et cetera, to help them understand issues of value. And so they're going to be asking for data collaboration, as Stefaan calls it. And so that means that we're going to need to understand what data we can give. And as global organizations, so many of you chief data officers out there, chief privacy officers out there, CISOs who are out there, we're going to have to also work with them to understand some of the issues with that collaboration, right? It's not so easy to do, right? So how do we do it in a very responsible way? To Stefan's point, I have stakeholders, I have card holders, right? I have merchants, I have banks that I am a data steward for. I cannot just violate my primary data stewardship role to them by just giving the data to any government around the world that wants that data. So what information, and I use that word very specifically, what information can I provide to assist in a problem-solving exercise that then all boats rise, right? I mean, I think that that's really, really important. But it does mean I have to understand my data. I have to understand my responsibility to all of those that I have a stewardship or fiduciary responsibility toward, as well as then what are the purposes and what are the issues that we need to try to solve together. I don't think it's going to be simple. I think it's very worthwhile, but I do think that these are some of the issues that responsible data sharing and ethical data sharing are going to have to solve.
Thanks, Joanne. Stefaan, I might pull you into the conversation here on this exact point, because you have done a ton of work in this space on what that data stewardship role looks like. And I want to touch on something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, which was that data is originally given for a specific purpose, and then we're talking about data reuse, which might be for a slightly different purpose. Could you talk us through that scenario, how you see that playing out, and maybe some solutions that might present themselves? Does technology play a role? Joanne just mentioned, and actually it's come up in a question from the panel, from the audience as well, about privacy enhancing technologies. Could you talk through us a little bit deeper about how this space is evolving and what best practice might look like here?
Yeah, well, I think that's the, from my point of view, anyway, when I talk with people about data governance, from my point of view, the data reuse is the challenge and opportunity of the data space from my point of view. I think we know pretty well how to map. I mean, the fair information practice principles have been around for 30 years. We know very well how to deal with managing data in a responsible way for the purpose for which it was collected. I think the real challenge and the real opportunity is exactly how do we start using that data for other purposes? How do we start using, like I was just reading, anyway, new research that was sent to me, where anyway, data from connected cars are being used to inform transportation policy, right? So that we actually know what really happens on the road, as opposed to have recorded behavior by police once an accident happens, for instance. And so this is a clear reuse situation, but the same thing for, anyway, financial data can tell you really about what the gig economy looks like and can inform whether we need social protection for those working in the gig economy, for instance. Anyway, just a few use cases that are out there. And I think, anyway, as I said, it's not because we are talking about reuse that suddenly all purposes go, right? And I think that's where, from my point of view, we've lost the North Star a little bit, is that we need to actually, as a society, say what kind of purposes, anyway, from a societal point of view, are in the public interest for which we actually need to figure out reuse, right? And I think that would already be a good start to actually, instead of saying everything goes, saying what are actually the public interest purposes, right, that we prioritize, and then think through, as you asked me to do, think through the scenario of actually accelerating reuse towards those goals. And that will require then indeed, anyway, an understanding of the questions and what type of questions there are. And as you know, here at GovLab, we've tried to contribute to actually this prioritization by engaging in or initiating an initiative which we call the 100 questions, right? I mean, I'm always surprised sometimes that if you talk with, anyway, we do a lot of work with cities, and cities always say, anyway, we need a data strategy. And I say, well, can you give me 100 questions that, anyway, if you as a city would answer, your city would be better off? Then most of the time I have blank stares, right? So it's all about the data as opposed to the question. Well, let's turn it around, right? Let's try to see what are the kinds of questions that are important. And then, anyway, once we have that formulated, then we need to really start thinking about what are, anyway, ways to access it, but also what are responsibilities. Because from my point of view, data responsibility is not just protecting data, right? It's also, data responsibility is also thinking about how do we make sure, right, that social impact can be provided with the data that we have. It's not just a reactive, it's also a proactive responsibility. And that involves, as Joanne said, it involves, anyway, a methodology to at least be open for solicitations for reuse, but then also have a methodology that can evaluate, right, whether the solicitation is fit for purpose and under what conditions would be appropriate, to go to Daniel, legal and ethical, right? Because it might be legal, but still not ethical, right? So under what conditions is it legal and ethical to actually provide access to some of those data sets? And on top of that, we also have to start as a society realizing, and who will ultimately support all of this, right? Because quite often we assume that this is just a governance challenge. It's also a business and a funding challenge. This is not free. And I think as a society, we really have to start thinking about what are ways to sustain this if we are approaching this from a public good point of view. And I think, anyway, we need a lot more innovation in that space as well. So to come back to your question, is this a policy or a technology? It's policy and technology and business from my point of view. And you cannot separate them, but you need to combine them in a way to provide a fit for purpose kind of approach. There is not, anyway, unfortunately, the bad news for everyone here is that I have no, anyway, thing here on my shelves that I can, anyway, take off the box and give to everyone and say, this is your data collaboration solution. We're gonna have to really think this more as a process than a product. And I think that's what we need to establish.
Thank you so much, Stefaan. That really brings us full circle, that process idea that whether it's sharing data for a public good or whether it's for commercial purposes, as Joanne was talking about, that responsibility of the organization, that responsibility of the, not just the chief data officer, but everybody in the organization is really something which is a process. Daniel, I'd like to come back to you because your project is broader than just data. Data, of course, is an input to innovation, but there are many others. And I would like to ask you just sort of to step outside the box of just the data piece for a moment. Are there any lessons that you think that chief data officers can learn from maybe some other roles in the organizations that you explored as you were undertaking this data responsibility journey through your project?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there are a lot of lessons learned in other organizations. Some organizations have dealt with security and privacy issues before they dealt with the ethical issues. And those practices on how you secure your data and how you secure your technologies can be applied into various realms. And in fact, we're looking at the maturity model of organizations and how mature they are and how responsible they are in dealing with technology. And that entire cycle really starts with understanding who you are and your values as an organization, and then translating that to principles, as JoAnn's mentioned, and then beginning to operationalize it into a governance model that allows you to actually manage how you deal with the technologies and the data. But to go beyond that, organizations have really done a lot in integrating their processes into existing processes. You don't want to reinvent the wheel, and existing processes and how you secure an application or the technology or the data can be completely transferable. And if you're able to do that, we're seeing organizations who are more mature have built this into the overall process and the way they deal with technology. And that level of maturity shows that they have systematic approaches, it's proven, and they're beginning to adapt it and use it for these new ideas that are coming, or new issues that are coming up around ethics. One thing I want to mention earlier is that your question around whether it's the policy or the question from the panel, whether it's policy or technology, it's actually in a lot of ways a cultural issue as well. We've learned over this past year, different regions of the world have a different interpretation or comfort around sharing of data, around contact tracing, for example. In some Asian economies and society, they're just more comfortable in sharing data for the public good so that contact tracing can be done in a more kind of systematic way. And other countries, and the more Western countries, generally speaking, are less comfortable with that. So whether it's a legal or a technology or a policy issue, there's a cultural component on really what drives people's behavior. And knowing what that culture is, you have to basically adapt that and see if your organization's culture and norms are comfortable with kind of the societal issues as well. So it's really the marrying of all those things, policy, culture, technology, legal, ethics, that you got to think about holistically.
That's so helpful, Daniel. Thank you. And we do have a global audience today. That's one of the silver linings of being virtual this year, is that we really do have a global audience. And I think all of the work that we've been touching on today has been truly global facing, both in its reach and its consideration. And I'm just looking at some of the other questions that have come in just about practical tools. There is a common question that I want to ask to everyone on the panel, and I want to make sure that we really have time to delve into this, which is really around given that this is a CDO audience today and you're all coming from very different perspectives and really looking at this issue holistically, which is fantastic, we are seeing a few common threads. Multi-stakeholderism is a really important one. The idea that this is a journey, or as Stefaan said, a process, it's not a product. And JoAnn, the point that you were making earlier on about how it's not really so much about what individual organizations are doing by themselves, even though it's that too, but what also matters is the idea of moving in concert. And on that note, I'm going to ask the panel exactly the same question, but I want to give you all a few minutes to delve into this one, which is, what advice do you have for the CDOs that are here today and the other stakeholders in this who are tuning in to watch us, that may have felt maybe until this point disempowered in their space? Maybe they want to do more, maybe they want to become more responsible as their organization share data, whether it is for commercial purposes or whether it is for public good purposes, as Stefaan mentioned. How can they become more active? What steps can they take? What can they do right now over the coming months? In other words, what can they go away with today that they didn't come here with when they tuned into us 45 minutes ago? And JoAnn, I will start with you because you did mention the code of conduct, and I'm interested to hear CDO to CDO what advice you have here.
Okay, so I think that, you know, if you are not already doing this and you feel that this is something that your organization wants to embark on, I think a lot of what Daniel was just talking about, you need to consider. And you need to be talking to senior management, and but before you do that, you need to be really thinking about how does data sharing really align with your commercial strategy, right? When MasterCard started thinking about our data sharing, and look, we operate an ecosystem, and we've been doing data sharing, right? It's one of our core competencies, right? And around that data sharing, we have built world-class security and world-class privacy is some of the first basic things that we made sure we have for our commercial practices as we connect, you know, thousands of individuals, merchants, and banks every day around the globe, right? So connectivity is really important as you're beginning to think about this. But if your organization is really just beginning to think about it, you need to be thinking from a senior management perspective, well, how does it connect to your business strategy, right? How does it connect from a technological perspective? What are going to be the roadblocks? When we started to move, and if your question is, Anne, how do you move from just doing it from a commercial perspective, where most companies are digitally enabled and they're sharing data with partners at this point, and they're sharing data for commercial purposes, and they want to do more, and you want to expand it to data for social impact. The question is going to be, well, how do you do that naturally and in line with your company's value proposition, if not your company's values? So if you don't know how to get from A to B, the other place to look is, where is the natural place for where your company's either philanthropic work is or where there's a natural extension? And so when we thought about it at MasterCard, once we recognized our core competencies in moving and sharing data, we also recognized that we have an opportunity, and really we believed an obligation to begin to think about using our data for social impact, because we also believed that financial inclusion and inclusion of all types is where we wound up, is really one of the responsibilities of our organization, right? An inclusive world, and a world where everyone is engaged financially was going to be a better place for everyone to operate in. And so depending upon what your organization does in the world, what good or service it offers, I would argue that data sharing from some aspect of social impact, and I like Stefan's 100 questions, is one of the things that you can be talking to senior management about, right? How do you want to be remembered in this world? We talk about that at MasterCard as our decency quotient. And so one of the reasons that we created the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth is because we believe that leaving the world a better place than we found it is one of the things that we believe. How do you want to be remembered is really how we sum it up. And so sharing information is a way to solve problems that we all face as humans, right? And so whether they're financial problems or health problems or climate problems, right? Or poverty being one of the financial problems, how do we begin to solve these issues together as society? And so that's just one of the ways that we've approached it. Does your organization have a similar place that they should be looking at participating, right? And so then you get into the questions that Daniel was posing though. Before you go talk, what are the legal issues? What are the data issues? What are the technological issues? What are the funding issues? This may not be the year, given COVID, to jump in with both feet from a funding issue. I don't know what your P&L looks like, but what is the natural journey that you could begin to go on where this begins to make sense for your organization? And then how do you do it with in a principle-based way to make sure that you are still being that responsible data steward that I talked about, that Stefaan talked about, so that you understand what information would be of value, right? And in what way, behind what types of issues could your data solve, right? And then we get into things like making sure you're being transparent about it, that you're being accountable, that you're using all the good data governance that we've been talking about. I think that's the kind of roadmap that you'd have to go down, and it wouldn't be insignificant. To Stefan's point, there are resources that have to be thought through, but the good news is that so much of this you're already doing in your commercial business. The place to also look is what can be lifted, because what we find at MasterCard is so many of our teams are doing things commercially that we can use in our social impact work, and so much of the social impact work can be crossed over to our commercial work, so that really everybody, all boats rise, and our employees, our data scientists, our data designers, our data quality people really enjoy the ability of being able to work both ways. And they love the feeling of being able to be so impactful, both commercially with their customers and clients, as well as from the ability to move things forward in the world that we occupy. So I'll stop there, but those are some comments.
Fantastic, Joanne. Lots of food for thought there, and to your point about whether it's sharing for public good reasons or for altruistic reasons or whatever it is, I think there's a lot to be learned there from what's happening already in terms of sharing for commercial reasons, like the stewardship role there, the responsibility role there is really important. I'll come to Daniel on that in a moment. Stefaan, what advice do you have for our audience today? Same question.
My advice would be to follow the advice of Joanne. I mean, that's that has always been my my advice number one. But if you push me to go beyond that, I would say I think anyway, many years ago I started advocating that anyway from a chief responsibility perspective, we not only have to think about how do we prevent misuse, but also how do we prevent misuses of the data that we have that could improve people's lives. And I think engaging in that kind of exercise, what are the kinds of misuses that if we would find a way to actually reuse data in order to improve society, I think having at least an initial deliberation and conversation about that would be anyway step number one, because as I totally agree with Joanne, is that it has to make sense, and it has to be something that initially, of course, at least the corporation stands behind. It's not if it's just anyway a response to solicitation, I don't think that's a long-term sustainable strategy. It has to be something that you really anyway are committed to. And many, anyway, if not most organizations obviously have a mission statement that goes beyond corporate, a commercial well-being or commercial gain. And I think just look at the mission statement and see what does that mean from a data point of view as well, how we can actually contribute to that. Then, of course, it's really important to not do this on one's own. And it's really about an engagement strategy, both internally, thinking about, do I have the domain expertise? Because it's not just data expertise that you need to actually tap into the data to generate insights in a particular kind of problem area. Or do I need to, anyway, bring in additional domain expertise, such as, for instance, what Joanne has done with the data fellows, right? Where you actually bring economists in addition, anyway, particular kind of economists that can actually generate different types of insight than you normally would generate. But surprise, surprise, in most organizations, there is a lot of domain expertise that quite often is untapped, and that could actually be also a strategy to unlock that domain expertise that resides within an organization. And then you need an external strategy. You already, Anne, referred to multi-stakeholdership. I think it's really important to not just build a multi-stakeholder kind of community around a possible reuse of data, where you bring in problem owners, other stakeholders that that really care about both responsible handling of data, but also leveraging data to make a difference, but also, of course, the public at large. Because and I will stop here, what we don't need to forget is that we do need to acquire a social license for reusing the data for other purposes than initially intended. Most of the existing consent frameworks, meaning you can add some questions here and there, would you be okay if we start reusing it for other purposes? But I do think, and this also goes back to the ethical issues that Daniel was referring to, I do think that you need to engage with your, those that, either data subjects or the public at large. To what extent do they feel comfortable, and under what conditions do they provide the social license to reuse? And I think that's a key element that one needs to take into account as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stefaan. And really, I think that that journey, that multi-stakeholder effort is really also going to be the key to unlocking some of the challenges of consent. Daniel, I'd like to turn to you. Same question. What advice do you have for the audience?
Yeah, I think, advice is just follow what JoAnn and Stefaan had said already, right? And I think I want to double down on one point there. Given that the social issues in our society are just really challenging to solve, no one organization can do it alone. And in order to do that, you have to go out there and build trust with your stakeholders. And in these multi-stakeholder dialogues, and I've seen the power of that happening, and in almost semi-private settings that competitors are sitting at the table, and people who have different points of views and maybe sometimes opposing points of views are sitting in these safe environments where under Chatham House rules, they're discussing the topic. And it's through these dialogues, these tough conversations where trust is built. And trust is actually, the number one value at Salesforce. And that's part of the reason why I'm out there working with the World Economic Forum and the rest of the society and trying to formulate best practices around ethics and technology. And it's really through that channel that Stefaan just mentioned, that open dialogue that you have that really flows internally, outwardly, and then through this entire network where trust is built. And through these discussions, once you have the foundation of trust, then you can begin to operationalize the actual tactics and the tools. But without that foundation of trust, none of this can happen. So I really want to end with that and say, no matter what we do around technology, that baseline of trust is so important. And the only way to do that is really engage with your stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you for saying that. Indeed, we have a project on operationalizing a responsible data ecosystem, which gave rise to this panel of amazing speakers here today. And I want to wrap up with a couple of really quick questions. They're open to anyone. Just to want to make sure that we're giving best value to our audience here today. There is a question about dark patterns, and I would assume that the answer to that one is that when companies are doing business with each other, they need to make sure that that purpose limitation, that data minimization is in place, that there is a level of responsibility in that interaction. I see JoAnn nodding there. JoAnn, you might have a comment on that one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is one of the most important things in any data sharing agreement is for purpose limitation as well as auditability of the use of the data. We rarely let our raw data, and we talked about our data fellows program. We do not let our raw data outside of MasterCard. We do not share data sets. We will share information insights, and even then we have very specific agreements as to how they can be used and how they cannot be reused. And then we also have auditability. And so everything is also time bound. And then also We also are very, very strict about how things can be communicated once studies are conducted. A lot of academic research that we participate in, we recognize that things can change. So we oftentimes want to do hard check-ins with researchers and other scientists to make sure that things haven't changed, right? So when you're doing different kinds of studies and research, it's really, really important to stay close to this type of work so that you can understand what the outcomes are going to be. And if things change, that you can also be part of the process. It's a little bit different when you are collaborating than when you are doing things commercially, which usually things are working on a much faster time frame. Things that are, some of these studies can go quite long. And so it's super important to stay close to your data.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, very interesting, that concept of responsibility sort of beyond the self-organization, if you will. Yeah. And the final question is a very academic question, and I'd just love to wrap up on this one. And that is, somebody is asking about how you view the application of all of these principles. Are they case-by-case basis, or are there common principles that we can apply? I think either Daniel or Stefan, or maybe both of you, would want to ask that question. Like I said, a very philosophical one to end up on.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I would say, this is where Joanne and I guess, started working on actually developing some common principles, and of course that's some of the work that we sought to accelerate within the context of the OECD. And I think there is still need, by the way, for a set of common principles that would oversee the data reuse. But obviously, the key is always, how do we go from principles to practice? And I think that's where we also need a lot more work, and to really work that not just assumes that those principles apply in the same way all the time. And I think it's really thinking about how do those principles apply across the data value chain, right? And that's where, as you know, we've developed this kind of data responsibility journey tool, where we really go through the value chain of data and really start reflecting on some of those principles, such as, for instance, have you well defined the purpose, for instance, which is a principle? Have you engaged with those that will be affected by the insight that might be generated, such as the participatory principle, and so on and so on. And so I think, we need a common set of principles. We have a few out there, but I think it would be good to at least be able to point to some that are validated and confirmed by a larger group. And then B, we do need to make that then practical and turn it into practice.
Fantastic, Stefan. Thank you so much for that. Really great to hear about the importance of the data value chain, multi-stakeholder cooperation. I think the key lesson that we can all probably take away here today is that this is not something that anyone can do by themselves, but everybody has a responsibility to build a more responsible data ecosystem. I want to thank this amazing panel, Stefan Verhulst, Joanne Stonier, Daniel Lim. Thank you so much for your time today. Please feel free to reach out to any of our panelists or myself via the Whova app. Thank you so much to MIT CDOIQ for hosting us here today. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and have gone away with learning something new about data responsibility. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you very much. Great job, Joanne, Stefan, and Daniel. A whole lot of questions came in from the audience, and you guys handled it really well in your in the stride of the conversation flow. So really thumbs up to you all for that. And I'm sure there'll be further follow-up conversations that'll spark out of this, and I'm sure people will be getting back in contact with you and ask you for further follow-up. So great job, well done, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Terry.
is accelerating rapidly, becoming more complex and immersed in everything that we do. From turning on our lights, to driving our cars, to selecting our next best product, AI is everywhere. Data executives have a tremendous opportunity to drive value to their organizations through AI. However, it is critical that these capabilities are built on trusted data and in an ethical way. Join us at the MIT CDOIQ Symposium to discuss the opportunities as well as the risks of AI and how to build that AI foundation in an ethical manner.
Data governance isn't easy, but if you follow the right plan, it can be a whole lot easier. The MIT CDOIQ Symposium is an exciting international event in which attendees and partners share and exchange cutting-edge ideas and content, as well as host thoughtful discussions through a variety of different industries and geographical countries.
This is Greg Ursetta with YDC. What is data monetization? The question is often asked by any data management organization. It's the act of generating economic benefit from data. The discipline leverages data to expose opportunities to generate revenue, reduce costs, and manage risk. Look forward to seeing everyone at the conference. Thank you.
Ever feel like finding your data is tougher than finding Sasquatch? Finding your data is as easy as search. Using natural language, find the most relevant asset, review the rich content, then query and done. So while we may not be able to help you find Sasquatch, we did find this.
I'm thrilled to be here with all of you for this year's MIT Chief Data Officer and Information Quality Symposium. We're excited to be a sponsor, and hopefully all of you are excited to be attending. And I'd like to welcome everybody to also attend our session on how to overcome data silos for holistic data governance with our own Peggy Tsai, Vice President of Data Solutions, and Jennifer Curtis, Enterprise Chief Data Officer of Freddie Mac.
It starts with an idea to create something that has never existed and boldly go where no human has gone. But bold ideas are more than just words. They are a nation not starving during a global pandemic. They are a family spending more happy moments together. They are the desire to create a better tomorrow. And data is the breath that brings these bold ideas to life. Boldly go on your data journey. Caserta will help you get there.
The biggest challenge in data analytics is that projects are failing. Gartner estimates that 50 to 80% of all data analytics projects fail. Despite having great new people who are data scientists, great new tools and databases, $150 billion in spent every year in tech, it fundamentally comes down to a people and process problem. And that's what DataOps tries to address. It focuses purely on helping people in their process with their tools, with all their data, be successful and deliver unparalleled insight to their customers.
Denodo is a leader in data integration and data management. We use a modern approach called data virtualization, which is a real-time data integration and data delivery approach. Global companies across the world have successfully used data virtualization for projects such as Agile BI, cloud data integration, data lakes, and also data services, and you can benefit too.